Hey, everybody.
Hi, Paul. Hello, guys.
Irfan and Shashi, how did you guys enjoy your long weekend?
Yeah, it was all right. It was not really a long weekend. We had a Monday in between, then Tuesday was off.
Well, that is, gosh, they found a way to still get you a Monday, huh?
Yeah. But yeah, these kind of holidays, half of the folks will be missing on that particular day. So they enjoy super long weekend.
Yeah. I think we have a pretty short agenda today. I don't know if you guys want to give it another minute or two for people to join in. I'm realizing that Maru.
Maru did add one more topic, so maybe we'll wait for him. And the first one that you did put, I did post a comment to that also, and I had a chat with Shashi. Shashi might not be able to join. He had some personal commitment for this time today.
Gotcha. Yeah, I saw your comment about that. I had forgotten that there was like this corner case around if the name ended with S.
Actually, the issue that we did run into was when we were using API Server Builder. I also ran into the same issue. So
Okay.
I am not sure if the same thing exists with KubeBuilder because I haven't tried it out. I just half an hour ago I saw your comment, and that's what I did remember. I did have a chat with Shashi though. He mentioned that this should be fine, but the reason he
Okay.
used multi-cluster in the name itself was to provide a disambiguation if you are using the API from kubectl, uh, which I'm not sure if it is needed as of now. So there
I
is a
see.
possibility that some other API might have a name, service DNS. It seems like a pretty common name.
Yeah.
Uh,
As someone that's dealing with inconvenient naming collisions in another area of my professional life, I can appreciate that. I tell you what, I will take an action item here to just like uh, start a like I can do this in a test project and just see if the name that we are discussing there like works okay, and I'll report back on that issue.
Sure, that seems fine. I'll take a break of 2 minutes. I'm getting a call, and it seems I can't miss it.
Okay, I'm just recording this in the notes.
Assalamualaikum बाजी. मैंने आपको
Irfan, you are not muted, my friend.
I'm sorry.
All right,
Yes.
that's okay. I'm just recording in the notes that, and I'm not in the right Google account, so I'm switching to the one that has write permission. I'm just recording that I'll take an action item to like evaluate the test the name out in a test project and report back on that issue. All right, and now I'm going to mute because my fan is going crazy. Maru, I think we're up to your agenda point.
Okay. I have a question prompted by my own experience and also a PR that Shashi has up to collect status. And the background on this is sometimes we have resources that are really that are written by controllers. They're not really intended to be written by users. Maybe they're intended to be read by users. But the question is, do we put that data in spec or status? The complication is that those things are treated differently from an API perspective, as I've discovered the hard way. The clients tend to behave in unexpected, well, they behave differently when you update spec versus status. You have to make a different call to update spec versus status, the errors you get back when, say, a resource has been deleted or has been changed, it's actually different. And also, as per the link in the agenda, if we really want to be calling resources status, and this is because when we're talking about, like, say, we're collecting status for a replica set, and our resource is going to be called replica set status, and then we're going to have replica set status dot status, and the type will be replica set status. And I don't know, like, it's kind of a pedantic thing, but there's enough sort of there's enough rough edges around this that I'm wondering if we can maybe think about whether the proper place for data in a machine written resource is actually spec. Does anybody have an opinion on this?
Yeah, go ahead, Paul, if you want to.
So I was just going to say I'm joining from my phone because I could barely hear that due to my CPU fan. Sorry.
Okay, Maru, even before this PR was raised, I and Shashi had a discussion on this naming scheme and how exactly to deal the machine written data, as you mentioned it. So my suggestion, or the best thing I could think of, and that's what I suggested Shashi, was that if we can figure out a mechanism where we can have a specialized API, and that API does not have a spec or status. It's like a third kind, and that basically contains the fields or the structure fields which are needed to be machine written or written by the controller. But what I think Shashi couldn't figure out is overriding or subverting the current built-in mechanism of auto generation of clients and definition of the CRD APIs, which basically revolve around the spec or status. So the option was to either use spec or status. So I think he went ahead and used status and then chose his name of status. So the other simple mechanism might be just use spec, and API name we'll have to figure out what we should call it. It should be different from the federated type what we are calling. For example, you mentioned for federated replica set we call status as federated replica set status. For this we might have to put in a different name or just the status. I don't know.
Paul, Maru, could you just clarify what the problem is? So we, across Kubernetes in general, machines write both spec and status many places. So what exactly is the problem?
Naming is the problem.
Is it just
I'm not
naming?
entirely sure. When you say that things write both spec and status, I think my understanding is that things that write spec are kind of old, and that was kind of before there was an expectation that there would be a separation of concerns and that users would write the spec, and where possible, machines, like machine stuff, should not be writing the spec. I mean, it does exist, certainly. Like notice the scheduler, for example, does that.
I mean, the definition of spec status have nothing to do with who writes it.
I'm not suggesting that. I'm suggesting there seems to be sort of a consensus that if you write something new, you try to avoid having user configuration changed, like changes by users mixed with changes by non-users.
So
I've heard of it. I struggle to imagine how that could work, because then, yeah, I mean, it's very difficult. Then you'd have to have separate one of those sections for everything, because anything can be updated by a user.
I kind of feel like that's kind of whether that's a valid concern or not, given that we're having something that is solely intended to be written by a machine. So does that matter where we put stuff? If it's solely written by a machine, does it matter that we put it in the spec instead of the status? That's more the concern, I guess.
My off-the-cuff answer to that would be it's irrelevant whether it's written by a human or a machine. It's a question of whether it is part of the specification of the thing, or whether it is part of the incidental current status of the thing.
I'm not sure if I understand what the specific concern is here. Is it the name of a type called status, or is it a question of where data, like, I'm not sure that I understand the connection with where data should be stored. So I wonder if we can just like identify exactly what the issue is that we're talking about.
The two issues are, one, the name. If I'm looking at a resource like replica set status is the name of the resource. Mm-hmm. And then to get the data out of it, do I get the spec or do I get the status? There's no spec or there's no status. It's one or the other. We're not going to have both.
I would say that, okay, sorry, go, I didn't mean to interrupt. Go ahead.
The other consideration is that in the case of the status, our initial use case is collecting the status so it can be used by the scheduler. And so arguably it's almost like more like specification for the scheduler than anything else. I don't know. So that's kind of like the one side, which is more sort of related to the type definition. And the other side is, I've noticed that there's discrepancies between how status updates fail versus how spec updates fail, or just updates to non-status. If you remove a resource, you would expect to get not found if you try to update that resource subsequently. If you're updating the status, you actually get a conflict because it's been removed underneath it, and it just deals with it differently. And you actually have to follow a different procedure for detecting errors. And I've gone through the process of dealing with that in rewriting the propagated version handling, which actually stores data in the status, similar to how we're intending to do for status collection. And I'm kind of like, do we want to have to worry about sort of different ways of handling errors, or should we just update the spec and not do that?
So in terms of the question of where the data goes, the specific data that we're talking about is the status from the statuses of all of the different resources that Federation has deployed to different clusters for a particular like federated deployment. Correct?
Correct.
As an example. And in terms of just where my own thinking goes, it seems like this is, and actually to put a pin in that for a second and paint a complete picture. So I think the scenario is, say that you have a federated deployment called My Deployment, and you make a federated deployment status resource that is also called My Deployment. And what that status resource means is that the statuses of all the deployments that are placed into a target cluster of Federation by Federation should be in the status of the federated deployment status resource with that name. It seems like status of that resource is the right place for it to go, in the sense that that is information that is discovered about what is happening in the world. I do understand that, like, the type, a type having a name status, it's kind of odd, and we don't have a precedent that we can look to in Kubernetes, as far as I am aware, that is exactly like what we're exploring with the status API, where the declarative nature of the resource is solely that you should collect status about something that has its name. I get that that's kind of an unprecedented and maybe odd API pattern, but in the sense that a controller discovers that information about things that are happening in the world, it seems like status to me.
Paul, can I just make an observation? The rest of the Kubernetes API has a single object, which per thing. I mean, I'm talking in general terms now, and that has a spec in it, which gets written by various different things, and that has a status in it. And those are two different kinds of information. We explicitly elected to just cut that thing in half, split it up into the spec in one object and the status in another object. And that's where the name clash is coming from. The second object, we're now trying to embed either a spec or a status in that thing, whereas it is actually the status. That's what we did.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's status information, personally.
So I don't think it should be in an embedded status information, because that is meta status. That would be status of the status, which doesn't make sense.
Yeah,
And one might even make a similar argument that the base resource shouldn't even have a spec, because presumably it, I don't know if it has any status, because we took the status out of it. Or does it have
I'm not sure if I am understanding your comments right, Quentin.
So we've got a federated replica set, right? And a normal Kubernetes replica set has a spec and a status inside it. And we decided to take at least some portion of the status and put it in a different thing called a federated replica set status. Now, is what's left behind all just spec? Or does it have...
It is so far.
Federated replica set only... Does it actually have its own status as well as a potentially associated federated replica set status?
Yeah, that's a good point, and that's one extra complication that I think makes tough to talk about this. So, Quentin, I think what you have in mind is that the federated replica set may have its own intrinsic status, like, for example, observed generation, that a controller has last seen of this particular object, right? That is distinct from the aggregated status data for the resources that are eventually deployed. That's what you're hitting on, right? In part, at least.
Well, I just want us to be, so we took some status out of federated objects, and I just want us to be clear, because this problem is going to come up over and over and over again unless we're clear on exactly what we did. Did we cut it into a spec object and a status object, in which case they shouldn't have an embedded spec and status inside them? Or
right, Erfan raised an issue around that I think is particularly relevant, which is that current CRD generation mechanism doesn't really allow you to avoid having embedded spec or status.
Yeah, and that is because this CRD mechanism is for the Kubernetes style API. So all the machinery and everything is built to present a Kubernetes style API, which will inherently have a declarative state, and at any given point of time, the current state of the system, or the system is trying to achieve that declarative state. So these two are represented by spec and status. So what we are talking about is having our API a little different from this. And we have been using...
a lot different, to be honest.
Yeah, and we have been using this machinery. So I don't know where that leads us.
Well, so what I can do is briefly mention what some earlier thinking was that we changed, and maybe that'll help to bring some clarity. So some earlier thinking, I think in V1 essentially, the status of a federated object was precisely that. It was the status of that object. So for example, if you wanted a replica set with 100 replicas, be they or not spread across multiple clusters, the status would reflect how many of those replicas were actually running, etc. And then independently of that, there were the actual replica sets in each cluster, and those themselves had a status which was actually reflected in the cluster. And that the both spec and status of those objects in the underlying clusters could also be mirrored or cached in the federation control plane. And linked together either by name convention or by labels, which was the original proposal. So that's a different way of thinking about the problem, which makes a lot of the previous discussions problems kind of go away. I'm sure might introduce some other problems, but it certainly solves the problems under consideration here. I think the reason we separated the status of the federated objects and created the concept of a federated replica set status was because we couldn't decide what that status should look like. And therefore, we didn't want to, we wanted a separate object that could be more easily prototyped, iterated on, and maybe different versions of it could be created.
That was the original motivation. There was an additional consideration that became overriding subsequently. Shashi had originally proposed that the status be actually stored on the federated like template. And when I was reviewing it, I came across a number of problems with that proposal, probably the most important of which is the way that we determine whether a resource in a target cluster needs updating is by comparing the resource versions of the templates and the overrides and the version.
But sorry, just to
that
be clear, there's a difference between a template and a federated object.
When I'm saying, when we talk about a federated object, it's really sort of a composite, and the template and the override and the placement are the component resources.
Yes.
So,
but that composite object potentially has a status, so it's different than the status of the template, just to be clear.
Fair, but I mean, if we're going to be storing...
I mean, when I create a specific instance of a federated replica set, that's a thing.
Right, so we're talking about...
users, yeah.
Right, so that we talk about that as a target resource, and you can have a target resource per member cluster. And the federated resource is more of the generic representation that is going to be applied.
I think we're talking past each other, Maru. I think we're misunderstanding each other.
All I was trying to suggest is the reason we couldn't store status directly on the federated representation, or the template, as I was discussing, is because we use resource version to determine, as one component of determining whether a resource in a target cluster needs to be updated or not. If we start storing status there, we actually affect the resource version, and we break that versioning mechanism. And so moving the status into a separate resource was a way of avoiding that possibility.
Well, so in the original, yes, in the original V1 implementation, that version number was not used. We actually compared the specs, and if the specs differed, we updated them. Yes, I mean, sure that problem needs to be resolved, but I'm becoming increasingly worried that we have a sort of a disconnect on some of the fundamentals of the actual API, and that might be where the discussion around where should status go and should it be called status and all of those sorts of things came from.
Well, sorry, I'm not clear what you mean by disconnect.
Guys, I think it would pay here to take this conversation back to the question of Shashi's current PR. I think the question is, should the status of the status resource, which is the plan that we had a consensus on previously to explore, and is the work that he's done at this point, should the status information of the deployed, for example, federated replica sets be in the spec of federated replica set status or the status? And I think that I believe that it's status, and that it should go in the status resource in terms of what should happen with that PR.
Paul, there is a third
about
option also. So there could be a third option also, where this is sort of a specialized resource which does not have a spec or status, and whatever information is there is directly inside the API. I mean, if you
I
could,
believe there are
Is
examples
that
of this
option?
already. There's precedent for those kind of objects.
There may be
Sorry,
precedent for them, but the machinery that we have to easily create them doesn't easily give us something that works that way.
that's
So
completely.
That,
Config
I mean,
maps.
that was my assumption based on what Irfan was saying. Is that the case? I mean, if we could put it not in spec and not in status, I think that's ideal. But do we have supporting infrastructure to enable that, or is it going to be like more difficult?
That's the problem, Aru. So that's what like Paul mentioned, and the reason Shashi did raise the PR the way it is, because I think he could not find out a clear or easy mechanism to do that.
yeah, so I would say that just in terms of like a practical way to move forward, I hear and understand that the viewpoint that it's different from a normal API. I would say that like regardless of how anybody may feel about that, like the easy mechanism that we have to use, which is like vastly simpler and more expedient than trying to build something that has the exact right properties that folks may be looking for about not having spec or status. Like the effort trade-off is like minimal effort versus enormous amounts of effort. Just in terms of a practical way to move forward, is it harmful to put it in status? I don't think so.
I'm just not sure why. Like, I kind of, whether or not this is what Quentin intended, I got the sort of impression that status on a resource is really status about that resource. And so if we're just collecting data from something else, to me, the appropriate place would be in the spec. And if we want to collect status about that spec, that's a different story. But I mean, we're kind of misusing this stuff, but to me, like just a simple rule could be, if you're collecting status about this resource, status, otherwise put it in the spec. And that would guide my decision to change the propagated version. Well, go ahead.
It's confusing both ways, Maru, to answer your question. I think it's more confusing to have it in spec than in status. Not when you think about it carefully, as you have just done, I can definitely understand the sense and maybe even agree with you that spec is the right place for it. But if you have to try and explain to every user why we're putting the status in the spec, it's going to drive everyone crazy, I think. I think the answer is to not have it in either, because it doesn't make sense to have it in either. If we can't do that, let's do the thing that Paul suggested, which is apparently both the easiest and, I would argue, superficially least confusing to users, although I think it's still going to cause confusion, and I think we're only just scratching the surface of the problems that we have potentially created for ourselves by moving the status out of the object itself.
Okay, how about renaming?
Use cases, not users, but scheduling. I'm not really too concerned about the usability of this, but that's just me. I'm fine with it going into status.
Yeah, how about renaming the API to something which might indicate similar meaning, but not confusing? Like right now, we are renaming it to federated, for example, federated replica set status.
I don't think there's anything confusing about that. I think it's just the irritation that it has that a status object has a status inside it. And I think we just have to get over that irritation and say, yeah.
Okay.
Because we can't do it the other way. We know what the right answer is. The right answer is take the status wrapper away on the inside, so that you just have fields there, like config map has, I believe. But we don't know how to do that, so we're not going to do that, which is Paul's suggestion, which I think is perfectly reasonable.
I've always thought of myself as being perfectly reasonable, so I'm glad someone else sees it.
Well, I mean, the best part about this is it's not actually just double deep, it's actually triple, because we're going to have a status resource, the status field, or a status section, like section and then a status field, because you can't, we're going to be pointing to a list of or a slice of whatever type status.
Yeah, that's live.
Anyway, whatever.
Yeah.
Technically, I think that makes me 3 times as reasonable, but that's just me.
Okay, so that seems like a case to move ahead with.
I did add something to the agenda after this, which is that if folks recall, we had a discussion recently about moving the cluster registry to beta. And one of the action items that came out of that was that we felt that it was like very odd to elevate an API that had no controllers or no way to actually use the records in the cluster, or I'm sorry, the cluster records in any way to beta. And there was an action item that came out of that to introduce a concept of credentials to use to connect to the cluster. I have made a pull request to the cluster registry to do that. And one of the things that I did that I wanted to solicit opinions about in the working group is that federated cluster has status fields for the region and availability zone. I took those out when I basically copied federated cluster and renamed it in the cluster registry PR, because I felt that that might be perceived as too specific to federation. However, I think that if we remove the fields from that resource, that we would still need to have either like another resource in federation, which might be okay, or or find some way to store this information on I think I wound up, after talking with Quentin, deciding that my initial cluster connection name was bad, and I think I renamed it to cluster credentials, finding a way to store it on that resource. So I'm sure folks would like a chance to take a look at that PR. If people are ready to talk about it now, totally cool. Otherwise, I just wanted to direct people that it was up and mention that as something that I thought was worthy of discussion in the working group.
My only comment is whether we want to have condition. There was a recent discussion around status, because we're actually going to be collecting, or Shashi's proposing that we collect all status for any given resource that's targeted for collection, including conditions. And I was kind of concerned that we'd be collecting a lot of textual data potentially that could be costly. And he pointed me at discussions in Kubernetes to suggest that conditions are actually kind of deprecated and going away. And so
yeah.
we wanted to minimize that and just provide healthy, not healthy, or something like that, versus something more elaborate.
Yeah, that is a good point. I am aware of those, of the idea that the APIs that use status that use the concept of condition are mostly APIs created by people that were very intimately entwined in the discussion about modeling status as a set of conditions. So I think that's a good point and worth thinking about. Honestly, I'm agnostic. As someone that's spent a lot of time and energy on very you know, on the more academic aspects of API design, I'm happy to defer to a higher authority on the matter of whether to use conditions or not.
Just to clarify, are conditions basically name value pairs that aggregate together to form some kind of status?
Well, so the condition is basically it's a name value pair that also has prototypically additional information about when is the last time this like attribute of the status was probed. When was the last time the value transitioned into something new?
Okay. All of which seems pretty
cetera.
reasonable. But yeah. Okay.
They do, but the argument against them is that if I can go out to tape and familiarize myself with them, or spool it back into memory, was that treating these things as kind of generic data types instead of specific attributes, like an array of generic conditions that have a name and a value, is less useful than a strongly typed API about the different attributes of status.
Yeah,
I believe
sorry.
was the argument.
I totally agree with that argument. I also have never understood what a condition is because it's a difficult thing to understand. But yes, my comment actually, just to clarify, was that it is reasonable to know when the value of a field was updated, when it was last probed, etc. I do agree that having typeless bundles of name value pairs is less good idea. I'd be happy if they've been deprecated, I would agree with them being deprecated, and I would support us overlooking them for now. Sorry, carry on.
Yeah, and I think the point you raised, Maru, is should we be making the cluster registry in general with statuses that have conditions versus strongly typed fields, right?
Yeah, I mean, as Quentin says, I think it's useful to know when things change, but like having arbitrary definitions of why they changed, I don't know that that's particularly useful. I mean, it shouldn't be that hard to just have it be really simple. Like, it's up, it's not up, here's when that changed.
Yeah, I'm agnostic on this. For example, I think there are a lot of places in the Cube ecosystem that are happily building APIs that have conditions. I am not certain whether the concept of like conditions are deprecated has wormed its way all the way through like the more central parts of the community. I'd be happy either way. Like the point that I thought was worthy of discussion is that we have these strongly typed status fields for federated cluster that are like the detected region and availability zone of the cluster. And I chose to remove those fields, which are specific to federation, from this very similar object that I created in the cluster registry PR. So the question is, like, do we think they should go into the cluster registry PR, or do we need to figure out how we're going to handle that in federation? Since the intent, I think, was to replace our use of federated cluster with this new concept in the cluster registry.
Can I just clarify something, Paul? Are you suggesting that region and availability zone are specific to federation?
Well, honestly, Quentin, I wasn't sure. And I chose to form the minimal possible bike shed accretion disk in the upstream by removing them. I'm happy to add them back in if we think that's the right thing to do.
And to be clear, I wasn't looking for an argument. I was actually just trying to help you out of your difficulty, which is I think they're not. I think they're fundamental properties of a cluster. I think any cluster exists in a region and possibly availability zone. And, maybe those are not known or irrelevant, but fundamentally clusters do actually exist. And that was why they were there.
I would
for the most part, things outside of Federation care equally about, am I going to use this cluster because it's in North America or not, or etc.
Sure. Yeah, that makes sense. And honestly, Quentin, I think it would be very productive to to have that in a GitHub comment. I'm hoping to get some feedback from folks outside that generally don't participate in the working group, but that are interested in cluster registry. So I tell you what, I'm going to make a comment there, just noting that I removed it. If you could comment with your stance on it, I think that would help to drive the conversation forward.
Sure, I can do that. And my apologies, when I did review the PR, it wasn't clear that it had been removed because for obvious reasons. So that's why I overlooked it at the time.
Yeah, it wasn't clear because I removed it and I didn't put any indication that I had. So I'm typing in a comment on it right now.
Just one very last comment on the idea of stripping things down to their least bike sheddable form, which I fully understand the motivation for. I guess the problem is when you end up with the situation we are busy trying to solve right now, which is the thing that was stripped down that far is no longer useful, and therefore people have to build another thing, and therefore never use the first thing. Which is the cluster registry. I mean, that was the origin of the work you're doing now. So I would argue that if somebody else is going to have to go and build another registry that tells them which regions and clusters they which regions and availability zones their clusters are in, then we're going to end up in the same situation we're in now, which is nobody's using the cluster registry.
Yeah, and it makes a lot of sense to me. I am perfectly fine with them being there. Honestly, I'm interested mostly in getting people to talk about it so we can move forward on this thing. So I will put into the chat window a link to where I made a comment. If Quentin, you oh yeah, SIG service catalog, that's me. If you can comment there, Quentin, with your stance, or other folks in the working group can, I think that would be great. I'm planning to reach out to some folks on the Google side and make sure they've at least seen the PR. And I think that's the end of the agenda for today.
Okay, then.
All right. Well, thanks, everybody.
Yep.
See you next
See you guys
time.
next week. Bye-bye.
Bye.